You know how people talk about their rock bottom? That moment they realized they needed to change their life? Mine wasn't a sudden epiphany. It was a slow, agonizing descent into madness, caused by 6 tiny, solar-powered spotlights. And a woman named Brenda. Let me set the scene for you. My name is Jake. I live in an entirely unremarkable, highly mortgaged, cookie-cutter suburb of Chicago, the kind of place where the biggest scandal is whether you put out your recycling bin before 7 a.m. on Tuesday. My life was tranquil, perhaps a little too much so. My one great achievement, the thing that set me apart from my neighbors, was my rhododendron bush. It was slightly overgrown, deep purple, and frankly, a marvel. To honor this shrub of champions, I bought 6 little LED garden lights. 6! They were 40 lumens each, a warm 2700K color temperature, basically the horticultural equivalent of a soft, comforting sigh. I wasn't trying to signal aliens or land a 747. They were just lights. They made my prize-winning, slightly overgrown rhododendrons look classy. I thought everything was fine. I thought I was a good neighbor. I thought wrong. The clock had just struck 8:00 p.m. on a Tuesday, roughly 2 weeks after my lighting installation. I was standing on my lawn, wearing a perfectly stained t-shirt, applying a mist of water. Yes, I mist. I'm a high-maintenance roadie parent. When the shadow fell. Not a dark shadow, but a sort of palpable, perfectly tailored silence. I didn't even have to turn around to know it was Brenda, my next-door neighbor. Brenda, who manages the HOA Architectural Review Committee, and whose sole purpose in life seems to be correcting the flaws of the universe, starting with my lawn. Jake, the voice was a low, impeccably manicured drone, like a vacuum cleaner running quietly on hardwood. She never used my name with any affection, always as a formal citation. I kept watering. Evening, Brenda. Beautiful evening, isn't it? She stepped onto my freshly misted grass. A deliberate violation. She wasn't looking at me. She was staring at my rhododendrons as if they were performing indecent acts. It would be, she began, pulling a crisply folded piece of paper from her pristine white linen shorts, if we weren't experiencing a rather egregious issue of light trespass. I nearly snorted, but I held it in. I am a gentleman, even when addressing a woman who speaks only in bylaws. Light trespass? Are you sure you don't mean ambiance? Because that's what those little guys are doing. She didn't react to the humor. Brenda never reacted to humor. The Kelvin temperature, she recited, reading from her note as if citing a major constitutional amendment, is generating what I perceive as excessive visual noise against the collective property aesthetic integrity of the cul-de-sac. Furthermore, the intensity, while minor, still constitutes an unnecessary emission of photonic energy past the established perimeter plane. I put the hose down. The whole interaction was so theatrical. Brenda, they're solar-powered. They're like glorified fireflies, and they turn off at midnight. Are they truly disturbing your sleep? She adjusted her large, expensive sunglasses, even though the sun had set hours ago. It is not merely the sleep they disturb, Jake. It is the principle. The bylaws, specifically Section 4C-E, outline that all external illumination must be either motion-activated for security or seamlessly integrated into the landscape design, and must not, I quote, introduce jarring or distracting elements to the nocturnal environment. Those, Jake, she pointed a stiff finger at one of the 40-lumen fixtures, are jarring. I rubbed my chin. She wanted compliance. Fine. I decided to be compliant, but petty. All right, Brenda, I hear you. You want less visual noise, better integration. I'll take them down tonight. Her face softened momentarily, the fleeting look of a predator who has successfully landed a deer. "Thank you, Jake. We appreciate your adherence to the collective vision." She retreated. I watched her go, then stared at the lights, still gently bathing the purple bush. I was annoyed, but also amused. Her complaint was so detailed and absurd, it almost felt like an achievement. But then I thought, compliance. I promised compliance. The next day, I didn't just take down the 6 solar lights. I went online and bought 6 new lights. These weren't solar. These were low-voltage, slightly brighter, 150-lumen halogens. They were still tiny, still pointed at the bush, and still a warm, friendly white. But they were exactly 110 lumens brighter than the previous set, which meant they were officially 275% more intrusive. I installed them perfectly, buried the wires, and set the timer. This, I thought, was a reasonable compromise. A solution that technically follows the rules, but tells Brenda to pound sand with the power of 12 extra lumens. The second confrontation arrived exactly 48 hours later. She didn't approach me this time. She waited for me to step out to grab the morning paper. "I see you replaced them, Jake," she announced from her driveway, leaning on a shovel, which she absolutely never used for gardening. It was purely a prop for intimidation. "I did, Brenda," I called back cheerfully. "Per your request for better integration, I used commercial-grade low-voltage wiring. They're much warmer, actually, a softer light, and definitely more seamlessly integrated." She didn't use her quiet drone this time. She went straight to the hysterical high-frequency whine. Her face was truly red now, matching the aggressive shade of her lipstick. "They are brighter!" she shrieked, actually pointing. "The beam intensity is now completely unacceptable. You have completely disregarded community standards and are actively generating a nuisance." "A nuisance?" I asked, holding the rolled-up newspaper like a shield. "Brenda, they shine on a bush. They don't shine in your window. They don't shine on the street. They shine on a bush. Is the bush offended?" "You are being deliberately obtuse. This is an act of blatant passive aggression," she yelled. That phrase, passive aggression, it hit me like a revelation. She was right. I was trying to be passive-aggressive, but the problem was I was failing. My passive aggression was still too passive. It was too small, too tasteful, too easily dismissed. That's when it clicked. Logic was useless. Compromise was useless. I needed to pivot from passive aggression to active, technically legal, overwhelmingly ridiculous aggression. I stopped smiling. I stopped defending the roadies. I looked at Brenda, right into her shielded sunglasses, and smiled a genuinely terrifying, wide, slow smile. It was the smile of a man who has just found the answer to the universe, and the answer involves a high-intensity discharge lamp. "You know what, Brenda," I said, folding my paper neatly. "You've made an excellent point about visual noise. I'll make sure the next installation is not easily dismissible. I'm going to make a statement. A big, tall, straight-up statement." She opened her mouth, but I didn't wait. I turned, walked into my house, and slammed the door, leaving her standing there, shovel in hand, staring at the perfectly illuminated purple rhododendrons that would soon be basking in the dim glow of cosmic insignificance. The Great Light War had begun. The moment I closed the door, the small, petty man who worried about 150-lumen garden lights died. He was replaced by Jake 2.0, the Illuminator. My descent into obsession was immediate and total. I spent the next 72 hours in a blissful caffeine-fueled haze, researching industrial lighting like I was planning the next Apollo mission. I wasn't looking at spotlights anymore. I was looking at sky trackers. I was looking at anti-aircraft searchlights. I was looking at the kind of equipment used to illuminate the opening night of a major motion picture. Or, guide a large vessel through a hurricane. My criteria list, which I printed out and stuck to the fridge, was glorious. Max lumens. Must exceed 25,000 lem. The more, the better. I needed to see the dust motes on the moon. Narrow beam. Must be focused. This wasn't about flooding the yard. This was about a pure, vertical column of power. Point 90. Degrees vertical. Non-negotiable. I needed to respect the no horizontal light trespass rule Brenda had so thoughtfully drilled into my head. Durability. Must survive a small tactical nuclear detonation, or at least a Michigan winter. Availability. Must be purchasable on a civilian website using a credit card. I found my winner. The X10K, a repurposed theatrical searchlight used primarily for major stadium events. It ran on a 10,000-watt xenon arc lamp and produced a retina-searing, narrow beam that peaked at around 35,000 lumens. It was designed to pierce heavy fog. It was perfect. It was also 9 feet tall, weighed 400 pounds, and cost more than my first car. First person. Insight. That's when I knew. This wasn't just petty revenge. This was a legal, architectural statement. It was performance art titled The Absurdity of Enforcement. And Brenda was my unwitting patron. Next up, the bylaws. I spent half a day in a local coffee shop reading through the entire HOA document, the city zoning ordinances, and the local county light pollution statutes. And what did I find? Gold. Pure, unadulterated, bureaucratic gold. Every single statute, every single one, defined light trespass as illumination that crosses a property boundary horizontally and impacts a habitable structure. It was all about shining light into windows. Since my proposed illumination event was pointing straight up, at the atmosphere, at space itself, it technically violated nothing. It was atmospheric testing equipment. It was celestial navigation assistance. It was a very bright flagpole. I researched the aesthetic appearance clauses. They mentioned things like tasteful color palettes and non-garish fixtures. Well, the X10K was pure, industrial gray. Very tasteful, if your taste runs toward airport runway architecture. And a single, narrow beam of white light is arguably less garish than 6 little twinkling gnome lights. Legal loophole secured. Now, I just needed someone to wire the damn thing up to my suburban garage breaker box. This led to my first interaction with the world of professional contractors. I called the most highly professional, well-reviewed local electrician I could find. Electrician Dave. His website promised safe, reliable, standard electrical work. I was about to test the limits of standard. Dave, hi, I've got a unique installation job, I began cheerfully. Dave, sounding like a guy who enjoys his work, replied, Great, Jake. New kitchen circuit? Garage heater? Tell me what you got. It's a xenon arc lamp, 10,000 watts. We're going to need to run a dedicated 240-volt line from the main panel, through the garage, and anchor the fixture to a newly poured concrete pad in the center of the lawn. There was a long silence, the kind of silence where you can hear a man's brain trying to categorize your request and failing. A landscape light? Dave finally asked, his voice now laced with deep professional concern. Well, it's going to be in the landscape, and it provides light, I reasoned. It's a repurposed theatrical searchlight. It's about 9 feet tall. 9 feet? 10,000 watts. Jake, what is this thing for? Are you starting a business? Are you filming a movie? Nope. It's for personal use. It's an art project. A vertical lighting concept. He paused again, and I could hear him scribbling. Probably a note that read, "Call the local sheriff's department." "Wait," Dave said, his panic rising. "You want this certified military-grade thing? Pointed straight up? Is this a memorial? A beacon?" "Exactly, a beacon, for my property value. And maybe, in a non-specific way, for my soul." "Jake," he pleaded, "I run standard residential jobs. I install outlets and ceiling fans. A 10K xenon arc lamp is industrial load. That's going to cost you a fortune in copper alone, and I'm going to need permits, engineering stamps, maybe an environmental impact report. But it's only 10,000 watts, Dave. That's less than some ovens, right?" I pressed, using my newly acquired superficial knowledge. Dave just sighed, a profound, defeated sound. "Jake, some ovens don't have a lens that can melt asphalt at 20 paces. Look, I appreciate the novelty, but I can't touch this. I can't. Good luck with your beacon." He hung up. Just like that. The realization that I was too crazy for electrician Dave was strangely encouraging. I was truly committed. It took another full day of searching, but I finally found Crazy Mike on a local contractor forum under the subsection Heavy Machinery and Questionable Aesthetics. Mike was an engineer who seemed to view municipal codes as merely suggestions for the uninspired. Mike answered the phone, not with a greeting, but with a loud sound like a wrench hitting concrete. "Yeah, Mike's Mobile Fabrication and Extreme Solutions. You got the money, I got the madness. What's the gig?" I repeated my request, skipping the art project pretense and focusing purely on the load capacity and the concrete footing. Mike whistled. "Oh, a sky needle. Haven't built one of those since the '08 bachelor party gone wrong. You got the juice for it?" 10,000 watts, dedicated 240 V, I confirmed. "Pah, easy. The footing is the real challenge. You want it anchored for, say, Category 3 hurricane winds, or just neighborhood gossip level?" I need it anchored to withstand the tectonic shifting caused by Brenda's fury. Category 3, minimum. "My man! I like the cut of your jib, Jake. The only thing I care about is physics. We can deal with the paperwork later. You pay cash for the materials up front. I bring the heavy equipment. When's the light get here?" The negotiations were quick, absurdly focused on structural support, and ended with a handshake agreement, over the phone, which felt appropriate for a man named Crazy Mike. I transferred a vast sum of money and felt a rush of adrenaline. I had crossed the event horizon. There was no turning back now. The Sky Needle was coming. The next chapter of my life was dominated by concrete dust, the smell of diesel, and the profoundly confused stares of my entire neighborhood. This wasn't a stealth operation. This was a spectacle. An open-air theater of suburban rebellion. The Searchlight arrived on a gray, overcast Thursday. It didn't roll off into a regular delivery truck. It came on a flatbed, chained down like an escaped circus attraction. The driver, a skinny guy named Lenny with a perpetually worried frown, spent a good 15 minutes looking at the delivery address, my suburban ranch home, and then back at the massive, polished industrial lens. "This," Lenny said, running a hand over the cold metal housing of the X10K, "is definitely not a hot tub. I've delivered hot tubs, bouncy castles, even a replica Trojan horse once, but never this. You sure you didn't mean the local Air Force base?" It's just the newest generation of landscape lighting, Lenny, I replied, signing the delivery manifest with a flourish. It's all about verticality now. Less light pollution, more sky. Lenny just shook his head, looking utterly defeated by the suburban irony of it all. Right. Well, I hope you have a forklift. This thing weighs more than my wife's SUV. Fortunately, Crazy Mike and his crew, a collection of burly men named Skip, Buzz, and inexplicably, Skip 2, Electric Boogaloo, arrived shortly after, driving a mini excavator and a cement mixer. The installation was nothing short of epic. They spent the first 2 days digging a massive hole in the center of my lawn, right where the purple rhododendron had once majestically stood. R.I.P., my flowery friend. You died for a glorious cause. Then came the steel rebar and the concrete pad. This wasn't a foundation. It was a bunker for a monument. I watched Mike supervise the cement pour, checking the slump with the intensity of a surgeon. So, Mike, I asked, leaning over the temporary fence of orange plastic, how stable is this structure? Really? I want longevity. Mike spat on the ground and gave me a thumbs up. Stable? Listen, buddy, if the apocalypse hits, you climb up this thing, and you've got a certified first-class lightning rod. That pad's 10 inches deep, got enough rebar to anchor the Titanic. You could point this light at the ground, turn it on, and the recoil wouldn't knock it over. It's not going anywhere. Excellent. We need to be able to withstand the tectonic shifting caused by local, neighborhood-level fury, I confirmed. Oh, the fury. Gotcha, Mike chuckled, clearly understanding the subtext of the entire operation. We call those neighbor-rated specs. Always over-engineer for the human element. The mounting of the light itself was a delicate, winch-assisted process. Once the heavy fixture was bolted to the concrete base, its massive glass eye stared blankly at the sky, waiting. It looked like a cannon designed to shoot daylight. The neighbors, bless their suburban hearts, didn't know how to react. They just gawked. They drove past at 5 Mai. They walked their dogs 3 times a day, staring with their mouths slightly ajar. Except for Brenda. Brenda was suspiciously absent. I assumed she was preparing an official declaration of war, likely drafted in triplicate and notarized by a team of lawyers. And I was right. On the afternoon before the scheduled activation, I found it. A thick, densely packed 4-page envelope slid beneath my front door. It wasn't a chatty neighborly note. It was a printed legal treatise titled Statement of Intent Regarding Gross Violation of Community Bylaws and Aesthetic Nuisance, docket number 2025-0004. I sat on my porch swing, grabbed a lukewarm diet soda, and read the entire thing aloud to myself, adopting a dramatic, over-the-top, lawyerly voice for effect. First-person reaction. Whereas, I read, projecting for the empty street, the proposed structure constitutes an unpermitted permanent fixture in direct contravention of Article 6, Section 2, regarding external structures exceeding 6 feet in height. Ha! It's 9 feet, Brenda. But it's not a structure. It's a navigational instrument. See how the wordplay works, people? She went on to cite irrelevant statutes, a state law concerning the safe operation of grain silos. HOA vague clauses. The infamous nuisance clause, which, as I had previously researched, was impossibly subjective. Threat of fines, a daily fine of $500 commencing upon first visible operation. I finished the letter, gently patted it, and smiled again. That terrifying, genuine smile. She had provided the exact legal trigger point. Now I just had to hit it. I framed the entire project as an artistic commentary on the tyranny of the neighborhood aesthetic. And Brenda had just written the dedication. The final phase was the wiring. Mike was meticulous, installing a dedicated, heavy-duty circuit breaker in my garage panel. "All right, Jake," Mike said, wiping his hands on a rag that looked older than I was. "She's wired, she's grounded, she's got a massive industrial-grade on-off switch right here, next to your recycling bins. When you flip this, you're not turning on a porch light. You're firing a photon torpedo. You get me?" "I get you, Mike." "Understood." He handed me a small, shiny metal remote, the kind you use for garage doors. "This is the emergency shutoff. Keep it close. And just remember, if a plane asks you to divert, you didn't hear anything. That beam is visible from the International Space Station on a clear night." I paid him in crisp $100 bills, shook his hand, and watched Mike and the Skips drive away in a cloud of dust and the faint scent of adventure. I was alone with my 9-foot-tall, 10,000-watt weapon of neighborhood peace. I prepared my launch party, just me, a folding chair, and a single can of slightly flat root beer. The sun set slowly, the final seconds before the show began. The entire neighborhood was tense. They knew something was coming. They just didn't know it was going to be the most beautiful, glorious, technically legal act of vengeance ever seen on this side of the Mississippi. I sat down, opened the root beer, and waited for the perfect hour, the moment of truth arrived at precisely 9:15 p.m. I chose 9:15 p.m. because it was late enough for maximum dramatic effect, but early enough for the inevitable authorities to still be on their first shift. You have to be considerate of the local police's schedules, after all. I took a deep breath, lifted the industrial toggle switch on the side of the X-10K's enormous housing, and flipped it. The initial result wasn't a flash. It was a thrum. A deep, industrial, electrical groan that sounded like a giant awakening. Then came the light. It didn't just illuminate. It erased the darkness. The 10,000-watt xenon arc lamp fired up, and a column of pure, white-hot light shot from the center of my lawn. It was laser-straight, knife-edge narrow, and disappeared instantly into the night sky, slicing through the suburban gloom like a hole punch through tissue paper. Atmospheric narration. It wasn't the kind of light that illuminated houses. It was the kind of light that illuminated space. The beam was so sharp, you could practically lean a ladder against it. The air above my yard shimmered. The color was clinical, almost blue-white, a stunning contrast to the cozy yellow glow of every other house on the block. The neighbors' houses looked suddenly dim, faded, and irrelevant under the visual representation of a mic drop that was my sky needle. I sat back in my folding chair, took a sip of root beer, and enjoyed the silence. The silence lasted maybe 20 seconds. Then came the noise. A collective gasp swept through the cul-de-sac. Doors slammed. Windows slid open and immediately shut. I could hear shouting, muffled by distance, but unmistakably angry. I narrated the sound for the benefit of my root beer. Ah, yes, the sound of property values entering a state of existential panic. Brenda's reaction. Internal monologue. I didn't need to see her face. I knew exactly what she looked like. She was probably standing at her upstairs bedroom window, trying to find a clause in the HOA agreement that covered active acts of God or celestial interference. I imagined her face, lit from above by my vertical beam, comparing her expression to an increasingly accurate GPS tracker pointing straight to her location. She was probably already on the phone with the HOA president, the city council, the governor, and possibly the Pope. Within 30 minutes, the inevitable happened. I heard the distant, subtle whoop-whoop of sirens. Not a full-blown emergency blast, but the cautious suburban approach. 2 cruisers pulled up, parking directly in front of the Sky Needle, their blue and red lights flashing weakly against the overwhelming white column of my creation. 2 officers got out. Officer Miller, young and looking like he'd rather be directing traffic, and Officer Davis, who had the weary, defeated expression of someone who just realized he'd forgotten his lunch. Officer Miller approached, shielding his eyes, even though the light was pointing straight up. "Sir," he began, using his most professional, by-the-book tone, "we're here regarding the atmospheric illumination event." I rose from my folding chair, put my root beer down carefully, and adopted my most polite, cooperative, yet intensely annoying persona. "Officer, welcome to the neighborhood," I said, extending a hand, which he hesitantly shook. "I believe you mean my single-point vertical light sculpture, or perhaps the experimental celestial beacon." "Are we having an issue?" Miller consulted his notepad. "We've received multiple calls. Extreme light pollution, disturbing the peace, and I quote, 'I think my neighbor is trying to establish a private air traffic control system.' Can you tell me what this is?" "Of course, officer. As I told my neighbor, Ms. Brenda, this is an anti-horizontal light trespass fixture. You see, after a very neighborly discussion about the unacceptable aesthetic trespass of my previous, smaller lights, I decided to engineer a solution that directs all its photonic output upward, in strict compliance with the local statutes regarding light placement." Officer Davis, the weary one, finally spoke up, pointing his flashlight at the massive lens. "But it's ridiculously bright. We can see this from the highway." "Yes, Officer Davis, that's the nature of a narrow, high-lumen beam. But tell me, is any of this light shining into a habitable structure? Are you experiencing any lateral light trespass?" I gestured dramatically to the beam that disappeared directly above us. Officer Miller scratched his head, frustrated. "Well, no. It's just going up. But the light itself is generating a nuisance, sir." "A nuisance?" I asked, leaning in conspiratorially. "Is it illegal to offend the local darkness, officer? Show me the statute. If I had built a giant, ugly 9-foot-tall wooden statue of a garden gnome, that would be an aesthetic violation. But this is light. Pure, vertical, non-trespassing light." The technical defense was too much for them. Miller pulled out his radio and mumbled into it. "Sergeant, we're at the location. It's a giant light, sir. It's pointing straight up. We can't find a trespass violation. Requesting backup regarding a possible atmospheric nuisance." 10 minutes later, Sergeant Reynolds arrived. He was grizzled, tired, and clearly regretted every decision he had ever made that led him to investigate a dispute over a suburban searchlight. He took one look at the beam of light, took one look at me, and sighed. A sergeant's sigh is a powerful thing. It conveys years of bureaucratic failure. "All right, kid," Reynolds growled, walking right up to the housing. "I don't care about your HOA nonsense. This is a public safety hazard. It's blinding pilots. It's interfering with police helicopter operations." "Sergeant," I countered, pulling out my meticulously printed packet of documents, "I have the FAA Advisory Circular 707460-1K regarding obstruction marking and lighting." I checked. Since the light is non-flashing and does not exceed 18,000 lumens in a horizontal direction and is not within a mile of a runway, it falls under the general low-intensity display category, I am, however, perfectly willing to put up signs warning migrating geese to fly at a lower altitude." The sergeant just stared at the document, then back at the beam, then at Officer Miller, who was now quietly laughing behind his hand. "It's light pollution, son. It's bothering people," he yelled, frustrated by his own powerlessness. "Sir, the Supreme Court has repeatedly held that mere offense or annoyance does not constitute a legal nuisance unless it involves direct, unlawful encroachment on property rights. This light, as we've established, only encroaches on space. And I think we can agree, space is not Brenda's property." Reynolds looked like he was about to arrest me for aggravated sarcasm. He walked away, conferred with his officers for 5 minutes, and came back defeated. "We can't cite you for light trespass," he admitted through gritted teeth. "But the complaint cites the noise, that high-pitched hum coming from the lamp housing. We're citing you under Municipal Code 45B, Noise Ordinance, subsection D, excessive operating sound past 9 o'clock p.m. Shut it off." I smiled sweetly. A brilliant maneuver. The noise, something even I hadn't considered. "A fair point, Sergeant. I agree that the hum of progress should not disturb the tranquility of the neighborhood. I promise to address that immediately with industrial-grade noise-dampening foam. However, since the unit is now running, and the violation is the hum, not the light, I require a reasonable grace period to source and apply the corrective material, perhaps 48 hours? The sergeant gave me a look that promised a lifetime of traffic tickets, but he was cornered by his own bureaucracy. He had cited the noise, not the light. 48 hours, he muttered, getting into his cruiser. If I hear a single hum after 9:15 p.m. on Friday, I'm sending the full zoning enforcement team, and they won't be as pleasant. As the cruisers drove away, their weak police lights swallowed by the majesty of the Sky Needle, I raised my root beer. A partial victory, but a resounding one. I had out-lawyered the local PD with a 10,000-watt, upward-pointing light bulb. The next 2 days were a whirlwind of noise-dampening foam, bizarre city official visits, and my brief, glorious brush with local celebrity. Sergeant Reynolds had promised the zoning enforcement team, and he delivered. The battle moved from the physics of light to the utter misery of paperwork. First up, the HOA meeting. It was held over Zoom, which made the drama even better, as Brenda's face was a massive, pixelated square of fury on my laptop screen. I attended with a clipboard, dressed in a surprisingly well-fitting blazer, and sat directly beneath the glow of the X10K, which I had angled slightly down for the meeting, just to annoy her. "The floor recognizes Brenda from Lot 14, the HOA president droned. Brenda launched into a highly emotional, Oscar-worthy performance. "The light, members, is a weapon. It is affecting our migratory bird patterns. My prize-winning dahlias are dying from the constant illumination. My children think aliens are landing. My sleep is ruined." "Objection, Ms. President," I interrupted smoothly. "I can provide documentation from my electrician, Crazy Mike, stating that the unit is equipped with a high-pass filter, rendering it entirely harmless to dahlias." Humor. I then launched into my prepared defense, complete with a hastily made slide deck. I called the light the beacon of Brenda's bylaws, arguing that it was a legally compliant structure, drawing attention to the ridiculous overreach of the HOA's vague aesthetic nuisance clause. Furthermore, I announced, sharing my screen to display a map of the neighborhood, since the installation, traffic flow through the cul-de-sac has increased by 300%. We are generating tourism. I propose the HOA vote to sell naming rights to the light, perhaps the Brenda Beacon, and use the proceeds to bolster our dwindling reserve fund. We could make this a landmark. Think of the hats." The screen went silent. A few of the less Brenda-aligned neighbors actually muted themselves to laugh. The HOA president, however, was not amused. He tabled the motion, citing lack of a proper 14-day notice for a revenue-generating proposal. Another draw. The next day, Mr. Henderson from City Zoning Compliance showed up. Henderson was a miserable man wearing a stained trench coat despite the 80-degree weather. He looked like he was constantly searching for a misplaced sock. "Mr. Henderson, welcome," I greeted him, shaking his clammy hand. "I'm here to assess structural integrity, fence height, and electrical compliance, sir. Show me your permits." He pulled out a tiny, official-looking tape measure. Dialogue snippet. Henderson immediately went for the light space. He poked the solid concrete pad with a meter. "This ground mounting, sir. Is it rated for sustained vertical thrust? I'm seeing evidence of 15% aggregate contamination in the top layer." "Mr. Henderson," I sighed patiently, "that 15% contamination is actually a stray birdseed mix, and the structure is rated for Category 3 hurricane winds. We're not generating any thrust, vertical or otherwise. It's a stationary lighting device." "What about the electricity? A 10K fixture, that's excessive draw." "It's on a dedicated, permitted 240-volt line installed by a licensed, if slightly eccentric, contractor. It's no different than operating a clothes dryer or a small kiln." I handed him the paperwork Mike had provided. Henderson was defeated by the CIS paperwork. He couldn't find a single structural or electrical violation. He packed up his tiny tape measure and drove off, muttering about the decay of civic order. But the light had unintended consequences. The local news blog, Suburban Spat Scoop, ran a story with the headline, "Local man beams middle finger to the sky in epic HOA standoff." I was interviewed by a breathless, extremely young reporter named Chelsea. I used the interview to deliver a series of highly quotable, sarcastic lines. "I'm not trying to bother people, Chelsea. I'm simply making a profound statement on the philosophical relationship between light and darkness, and how often we confuse rules with righteousness. The light is an act of love for my community. It guides lost travelers, and I've actually had 2 amateur astronomers thank me for giving them a perfect reference point." Narrative. I described my brief, bizarre fame. People were driving by, taking pictures of the beam that disappeared into the night. It had become a landmark. The beam. For 2 days, I was the most talked-about man in the county. Then came the hammer blow. It wasn't the HOA, it was the government. The city, HOA's combined legal team, desperate and digging through obscure regulations, issued a formal cease and desist based on a highly specific, obscure statute, an FAA advisory regarding non-airport lighting that may be mistaken for navigational aids along established domestic VFR flight paths. They claimed that the narrow beam could confuse small private planes or interfere with night vision systems used by state police aircraft. It was a stretch, but it had the weight of federal regulation behind it. The paperwork arrived, this time delivered by a professional process server, not a furious neighbor. And the statute was undeniable. The FAA always wins. It was a technical win for Brenda, but a hollow one. The fun was over. I read the FAA ruling 3 times. I could fight it, hire a real lawyer, and maybe tie it up in court for months. But the truth was, the point had been made. The light had served its purpose. It had shined a literal 10,000-watt spotlight on the absurdity of my neighborhood feud. Internal monologue. You gotta know when to fold 'em, right? The goal wasn't to blind the International Space Station forever. It was to prove a point with 30,000 lumens of petty. I had achieved peak pettiness, and now it was time for the curtain call. The spectacle was more important than the stamina. I decided to hold a final dimming ceremony. I invited everyone. Nobody came, but I narrated it to myself anyway. Crazy Mike and his skips returned 48 hours later. The dismantling was solemn. The neighborhood was strangely sad. The light, once a symbol of chaos, had become a defining feature. People waved as the massive arc lamp was unbolted from its concrete bunker. "Shame, Jake," Mike said, supervising the winch. "That was a beautiful piece of illumination engineering. What are you going to do with it?" "It served its purpose, Mike. It's going into storage. For now." As the flatbed pulled away, leaving behind a perfectly flat, gray concrete pad in the center of my lawn, the return to norm felt heavy. The darkness returned, vast and familiar, and the neighbors' soft, yellow lights seemed even dimmer than before. Then came the final confrontation. "Brenda!" She saw the light being taken down and approached me, radiating self-satisfaction. She wore an expensive smile, the kind that costs 3 figures at the dentist. "Well, Jake," she said, pausing dramatically next to the empty concrete pad, "it seems reason has finally prevailed. The collective vision is restored. You should have simply adhered to the agreed-upon standards the first time. It would have saved the community a great deal of trouble and the FAA a costly investigation." She was gloating, savoring her victory. I listened patiently, letting her have her moment. "You won, Brenda," I said, nodding slowly. "You absolutely won the war of bureaucracy. That FAA statute was sharp. I concede the point. The light is gone, and the darkness is safe." She folded her arms, her chin held high. "I knew it would come to this. A nuisance is a nuisance, Jake." I waited for her to finish, then delivered my final, perfect line, a true masterpiece of conversational, dismissive wit. "You're right, Brenda. It was an illegal nuisance, which, in a way, is a shame. Because that light, that beautiful, illegal beacon, was designed and installed specifically to not shine light on your property. Now that it's gone, I'm free to go back to my original, fully legal lighting plan, where I can shine the light wherever I want. And here's the best part. Thanks to you, I now know exactly how much light it takes to get the government involved. I can dial it down and still be wildly annoying, but utterly compliant." Her face, for the first time, crumpled. She had won the battle for the sky, but lost the war for her sanity. The true retaliation. The aftermath. The next day, I didn't reinstall the 6 polite halogens. Instead, I installed 101-watt, motion-activated flickering LED fairy lights, the kind that flash randomly and aggressively when a squirrel walks by. They were individually staked around the perimeter of my yard, pointed inward, all of them on 12-foot poles to technically exceed the height requirement for a standard fixture, but below the structure threshold. They were certified, compliant, and generated a low-grade, epileptic, disco ball effect that was arguably more jarring than the beacon had ever been. I explained this new, low-grade torture to the viewer. The FAA doesn't care about fairy lights. The HOA can't ban motion sensors, and Brenda now lives in a constant, low-level state of visual agitation every time a breeze rustles my rhododendrons, which are thriving, by the way. The end note, the legend of the Sky Needle, however, continued. I sold the X10K to a very grateful nightclub owner in downtown Miami, who now uses it every Saturday night. So I raise my glass of cold root beer to you, the audience, and confirm that sometimes the most hilarious victory is simply the most absurd. I lost the battle for the atmosphere, but I won the war for the soul of the suburb. And Brenda? She's now lobbying for a complete ban on intermittent illumination events, which is basically her admitting defeat to 100 tiny, flickering legal lights. Cheers.